All right, guys, this is it. The dawn of a new era. I'm starting a weekly meta report series that will, some of you guys might, remember that I once used to do a weekly meta report series on this channel, but this time with a lot of changes. And yeah, it's actually going to be weekly. I know, right? So here's the deal. My objective as a content creator has always been to provide you guys with the highest performing decks possible, which is, why I set up the site and why I, have started kind of like doing these deck updates and why I've spent so much time meticulously updating all of my decks. However, I also want to help teach you guys about matchups and how to counter certain decks, as well as, deck building techniques. So I'm going to be adding those into this series as well, talking about specifically how to counter certain kinds of decks. What, when I talk about each deck, I'll be talking about what it's good against and what it's bad against and why. I will also be starting to put new decks this week as a rotating segment on these videos. So I will be covering decks that, are doing well on the mobalytic stats, or decks that I've made myself that are probably kind of experimental, and we'll see how it goes, right? Things that might be good against the meta at the time as well. To be perfectly honest, this is a game changer, because when I initially started doing my weekly series, the reason that I stopped doing them weekly and started doing them, you guys might remember, in kind of like more monthly installments, was entirely because there were a lot of periods where the meta didn't really change, right? And so I was just sitting there thinking, I mean, what's the point of just recording the same meta video as last week if the meta is the same? But now it's completely different because we've got a lot of interesting stats that are coming through. I started the series before we even had like fully fleshed out stats on mobalytics, and there will be a lot more to talk about on a weekly basis in terms of, even if the meta is largely the same, there will always be new decks that are surprising with their performances on a week-to-week basis. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to be breaking down the meta shifts in the last 7 days. I actually have a lot to talk about because since the patch, the meta has shifted and dramatically changed the performance of a lot of decks. I'm going to be talking about how to counter Irelia Azir, which is a very powerful new archetype that has come up on the scene. I'm then going to be breaking down 10 new decks. Well, actually 5 of them are going to be new decks that have, come since the expansion, and 5 of them are going to be older decks that are going to be, I think, decks that I would recommend for this week through various things, mostly good decks that are against the meta right now, decks that have been kind of on the rise, but pre-existing archetypes. Of course, that being said, every single deck on my website has been updated, so even if your deck isn't mentioned in this video, you should still be checking that out so that you can get an updated version of whatever archetype you're playing. Now, I'll pull up my site tier list now. Keep in mind, this is a tier list of my personally built variants of ladder archetypes. So each of these decks is meticulously built by me, and it takes a lot of time. I'm, always constantly tweaking decks and changing card ratios, and every single week I will go through at the time of posting this video and make sure I have updated every single deck, even though I do want to spend more time in these videos moving forward, focusing on specific decks. I decided that I have way too many archetypes listed on the site that I'm constantly updating, and these videos would go too long if I talked about every single deck every single time and all their changes. So here's the compromise. I'm going to start only discussing the decks in the video that I think are good recommendations this week for specific reasons, or that have seen, major card changes or whatever. And if it's not one of the decks that you currently play, you can still go to the site and still get an updated version of whatever archetype you like. So if you want updated versions of any of these archetypes, you can head over. There's in the pinned comment below, there will be, a link to the site where you can go here and find updated versions of any of these decks. Why is this important? Because the meta is an ecosystem and different things are going to have to change based on what you are seeing. That's most of the reason why these lists need to keep changing as they go, which is to be better at countering the things that we are currently seeing on the ladder. And speaking of which, this is the perfect time to talk about how the meta has shifted, what really has happened, and what the new incentives are in this, brave new world that is the post expansion. So what's this new meta like and why? Well, the meta has sped up drastically. What this means is that the decks that are doing well are decks that are able to either end the game faster, or decks that have the ability to stabilize dies much faster and more aggressively. This is bad news for decks like Shadow Isle's Freljord Control, you know, Watcher combo or whatever, or a lot of like Targon style decks that are focusing on outgrinding, although there are some exceptions. The reason for this is mostly off of the back of the advent of Irelia Azir, a powerful new archetype that I will be talking about in a little bit about how to counter it specifically, but the nature of this deck is that it's an aggressive combo deck and a pretty powerful one at that. So it does a really good job at beating up on decks like, you know, super controlly or super outgrindy decks that can't specifically really deal with what this deck is trying to do, because most control decks don't have access to landmark removal or ways of efficiently killing Azir that can't be protected against here. So let's get to the point where you guys all clicked on this video for. How do you counter Azir Irelia? Well, to begin, we must first understand exactly what this deck is doing. So this is an aggro combo archetype. Aggro combo is a particularly dangerous archetype because combo decks, usually their biggest vulnerability is aggro decks, but because this is an aggro combo deck, it is able to combo pretty early, and what that means is that even a lot of the times that you play aggro decks against this, you're not always going to be able to race them down. Sometimes they have a very scary hand. So Azir Irelia is a deck where effectively the objective of the deck is pretty straightforward. You're playing an Azir and you're playing an Emperor's Dais, or you're playing two Daises. And when you have two of these Sand Soldier summoning things on your board, you basically just spam all the blade dances, those being Ribbon Dancer, Irelia, Blossoming Blade, and you can use recalls in order to reuse these effects from Ribbon Dancer, etc. And what that'll do is that'll just summon a shit ton of Sand Soldiers, and your opponent will effectively just die. This deck can do this as early as turn 4 or 5 if it gets a really, really efficient opening hand. Now, the reason this is so strong is because A, it's fast, and B, it's pretty undisruptible, because of course the linchpin cards here are Emperor's Dais, which is a landmark that there's not a lot of efficient landmark removal in this game, and of course Azir, which is a 3-mana 1/5 that levels so fast in this deck it usually ends up having 6 health anyway, and these are pretty hard cards to kill efficiently. There are ways of dealing with these cards, but usually when you're answering a Dais with something like an Aftershock or a Desert Naturalist, when you're paying 4 mana to their 2, you're not even necessarily winning the game by doing it, because it's not like these decks don't have other threats. So how do you deal with it? How do you counter this deck? Well, I'll give you 2 answers. If you're just looking for a specific deck, you know, to just net deck to try to counter this, I'll be mentioning a lot of these as I go through later in the video, but decks that are good this week at countering Irelia Azir are Thresh Nasus, Ezreal Draven, Dragons. Nightfall can be a good counter if you play Nightfall well, and also just general aggro decks like Discard Aggro or Noxus Shurima Aggro will all do even to slightly favored into Irelia Azir. As favorable as you can get this deck, sometimes they can still have like a crazy nut draw that they'll be able to beat even unfavorable matchups with. But, and here's the interesting answer, there's a lot more you can do in terms of countering this deck with specific cards or specific techs. Noxus and Demacia both have very, very good tools for countering Azir Irelia. In particular, one of the main ways you can counter them is through keywords that are going to scale with your ability to block units. So Demacia has great access to keywords like Fury and keywords like Tough that are going to punish the Blade's repeated abilities to attack into you by just giving you free blocks every time. I'm unironically running Chain Vest in many of my Demacia decks right now. Chain Vest is a pretty low-key card for a lot of reasons, as, you know, maybe like a 1-of or a 2-of. And for example, Fjordshan, I'm currently running it as a 1-of, and it's perfectly fine. It's pretty good in this meta for a lot of reasons, Azir Irelia just being one of those. Shyvana is hilariously effective into Azir Irelia, and spoiler alert, one of the decks I'll be talking about is Dragons, which is a super low-key deck right now for exactly that reason. Shyvana, of course, specifically, the ability for Shyvana to get Fury, so every time you block a dragon, you're gonna get your, every time you block a blade, you're gonna grow and get your health back, right? And also, she's gonna level extremely quickly, because when she deals damage, every time she blocks a blade, you're getting level progress on your Shyvana. Then you've got big lifesteal units like Radiant Guardian, also you have access to in Demacia, which of course has lifesteal and tough. Very, very good at just kind of bulking up and, you know, being able to survive their onslaught, but survival isn't just enough against the deck, you also have to deal with their threats, mostly Azir, which in this case, you know, you have tools like single combat in Demacia to be able to handle that. Noxus has a lot of efficient tools on their own, specifically, especially in a deck like Ezreal Draven, you're going to have tools like Culling Strike. Culling Strike is one of the most low-key cards in the entire game right now in this meta, because it will counter a ton of what the top strategies are doing. It's a really good card for killing Azir, although good players will sometimes have ways of protecting their Azir. It's a really, really good card for being able to deal with, for example, Thresh in Nasus Thresh. Culling Strike is stonks. Invest in Culling Strike. Other tools that Noxus has is in slower versions of Noxus, like Ezreal Draven. Scorched Earth can deal with Emperor's Dais in probably the most efficient way possible in terms of landmark removal. Again, some of the 4 or 5 mana landmark removal cards are just too expensive, but Scorched Earth is totally fine, and it's a card that is already got some versatile applications in a deck like Ezreal Draven, so using this to kill a Dais feels very good. Lastly, in Noxus, you also have Draven. Hilariously enough, I mean, Draven ends up doing a sort of similar thing to Shyvana in some ways, not nearly as good, but in particular, the fact that when they attack with the blades, usually they're committing multiple attacks per turn, which means you can use one spinning axe on Draven and he'll block twice that turn and level up, which is pretty good value. It's not going to be, you know, shutting down their game plan in any significant way, but the fact that Draven is a good card on its own that can get some just free value out of blades is pretty nice, because again, you do need to kill that deck quickly if you're not shutting down the game plan, and a level Draven is a free bonus on top of a few things. Now, I've heard a lot of people say that they really like Scargrounds for countering this deck, you know, Vlad Scargrounds type archetype, and it's definitely not bad, I think, because, you know, you are getting the tough keyword, but I don't know if it will be a super effective counter into Azir Irelia overall, especially against the better players playing Azir Irelia. For the most part, that deck can go really wide and kill you, and Scarground's decks are kind of notorious for not really being able to play a ton of units, so that one to me might be a bit more of a wash, but it's not necessarily a bad choice. Of course, all-in Fiora decks that have the ability to just slap a Chain Vest on Fiora is a hilarious counter as well, but there's actually one secret tech that I'm going to personally be using to counter the blades on my stream, actually. Well, at time of recording, it's tomorrow, but as you're watching this, I will be live potentially now, and there's actually a chance that I'm playing this card, Swole Squirrel, in a, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's gonna be a fairly memey deck, but in a Swole Squirrel deck with Might and Noxus, when they attack with blades, you will get free blocks. Your Swole Squirrel will easily triple, or sorry, not triple, but quadruple up its value and just end the game with Might. A really, really hilarious counter. Probably not going to be the most competitive, but it'll be really funny to do. And I plan on messing around with it just because at the very least, you will steal some wins in that matchup. So expect that video to come out, I don't know, maybe tomorrow. Those are the best ways to counter Irelia Azir. Now, we can talk about the decks, you know, the real meat of the video. What are the new decks coming in from the expansion? Well, I can talk about the one on the screen right now. Let's actually talk about how to play Irelia Azir, since I see a lot of people misplaying these decks. So, new format, as I'm going to be talking about these decks, because I'm only going to be I'm talking about fewer decks per video. It gives me more time to talk about a little bit of more of the specifics on terms of who I'd recommend the deck for, as well as general tips. Now, Irelia Azir is a deck that's a lot of fun. I mean, some people are kind of fed up with it right now, but I actually enjoy the archetype. I think it's pretty cool to play around. I love the aggro combo archetype. It fits my personality and playstyle very, very well. You guys know that aggro combo is just my favorite pattern in card games. And I love playing this deck. Now, a couple of pointers if you're looking to play this archetype well. The biggest thing to understand that I see a lot of people messing up is just to use the blade dances as, you know, finishers. And that's something that you should be doing in your mulligan. Usually in most hands, you are going to need to mulligan aggressively for Azir and Emperor's Dais. And, you know, maybe in some cases, Sparring Student and Dancing Droplet, depending on the matchup. Keeping these in the opening hand is good. But it means that you will need to be kicking the Blade Dance cards out of your hands because you're going to want to be drawing into those later. This includes Irelia, by the way. I mean, Irelia is a good card in the deck, but she's part of your finisher combo. She is a Blade Dance card, and you really want to see her after you've got your Azir and your Emperor's Dais, so she should usually be getting kicked in your opening hand. Unless, of course, you already have your Dais and your Azir, or double Dais or something like that. Another thing that you're going to want to do in this deck, and this is kind of where we get into, you know, more of the meta response, is that as people start to counter this deck more and more, there will be a lot of matchups where you'll have to slow down your aggression. That will be a lot more interesting when we see a lot more people, you know, when you're queuing into Ezreal Draven, for example, you'll have to, you know, refrain yourself from playing Azir until you can protect him with something like Retreat or Lead and Follow when they go in to use Culling Strike or whatever they might use to kill your threat. So this is a deck that I think that when you are playing into a slower matchup that isn't really dealing much pressure to you, but will force you to, you know, add a layer of protection to your stuff. Think matchups like Tom Soraka as well, where you're going to need to be able to protect your cards. You're going to want to take those matchups, you're going to want to slow them down and make sure you're playing more into the combo game pattern than the aggro game pattern. Overall, though, it's a super fun deck if you like just, you know, spamming a bunch of attacks every single turn. Sometimes this deck just attacks like 6 times in 2 turns for no goddamn reason, and I fucking love it. All right, the second new deck we've got this week is Midrange Dragons. Now, if you go to the tier list on the site, well, currently there's only 3 tier 1 decks, those being Thresh, Nasus, Ezreal Draven, and Irelia Azir, although it is actually hilariously possible that Shyvana Dragons will be joining these tier 1 brethren potentially next week. It's doing very well on the stats right now, and it actually has great matchup tables into these other decks. So Dragons is a typical mid-range deck. You're going to be basically just kind of like playing efficient units, trying to control the board a little bit, you know, making sure you have big bodies that aren't getting swept down, and making sure you have decent ways of dealing with opponent threats with tools like single combat, especially when paired with your lifesteal units, so you're not losing to aggro. It's a very balanced playstyle. So it's a pretty vanilla deck. It'll teach you the fundamentals of the game very well, and it's extremely well positioned into both Azir Irelia for all the examples mentioned before, as well as being pretty great into Thresh Nasus. You know, not super favored, but Hush is a really good counter to Thresh Nasus in general, and there's not a lot of other kinds of decks that can actually get away with running Hush right now. So if you want to play Shyvana right now, this deck is pretty uniquely positioned in the current metagame. Shyvana has never been more competitive. All right, the third new deck I've got is Shurima Nox Aggro. This one you might have seen in the video I made yesterday about, hey, this deck. Yeah, Shurima Nox Aggro. It's a pretty good deck to climb with. It is a good deck to counter Irelia Azir with. Keep in mind, Irelia Azir is a combo deck, which means if we go down to the bottom of the page here, you can see combo decks do well against control decks, which is why it is keeping a lot of the most styles of Targon and Freljord Shadow Owls out of the meta, but they tend to be very vulnerable to aggro. Usually you can race them down, and you'll have a slightly favored matchup as Shurima Nox Aggro rushing down even the fastest of combo decks. Now, this is a deck that I built based off of capitalizing on the fact that Irelia Azir is in many ways pushing Trundle Lissandra out of the meta, and because of that, adopting this swarmy early game plan is pretty hard to punish, and you can usually get away with it. The Battlecaster type swarm can often just kill the opponent, will basically set them to low enough health that they're effectively dead later to a decimate. As early as like turn 3 or 4, you can effectively have a game where your opponent might as well concede because it's over. This is one of the fastest decks in the entire game. You are ending the game at a blistering pace, so it'll lead to very short games, and this is also one of the easiest ones to play. People like to say aggro is easy in general, and honestly, that might be true, but there's certain aggro decks that are hard. This is not one of them. For the most part, you just have to make sure you're mulliganing aggressively for 1-drops and maybe, you know, every night Battlecaster. Don't keep cards like Merciless Hunter and Azir in your opening hand, and make sure you're, you know, saving your fervor smartly for when your opponent doesn't have a re-response or when you're stopping their lifesteal attack with a fervor block. New deck number 4, Chirean Burn. Now, you guys might also recognize this deck because this is another deck I built for the early days of the expansion. It's pretty fun. Unfortunately, it's actually a little bit poorly positioned into the current meta. Irelia Azir gives it a pretty rocky time. As mentioned, Irelia Azir forces the meta into a much faster state. We're seeing one of the, kind of like fastest metas we've seen. And what this means is decks that are built to be kind of like by design a lot slower aren't going to do as well. Now, sometimes this deck that's built around cloning Chirean Sumpworker, sometimes in a good hand, you'll have a very fast start and kill them quickly. But for the most part, the identity of a burn deck is an aggro deck that slows down in order to not be punishable by a board response, right? It's kind of the exact opposite approach as we saw with the Shurima Swarm, right? Shurima Swarm, I was saying there's less board sweeps right now, and so you can get away with like swarming more and speeding up. Well, a burn deck does the opposite. You're slowing down in order to not lose to sweepers. The problem is, again, that's not really what you want to be doing in this meta right now. Still a powerful, probably tier 2 deck, maybe on the low end of tier 2, could be closer to tier 3, but a solid choice if you're looking to play something in the new meta. Well, the more swarmy aggro playstyle exhibited in Shurima Nox aggro is a great recommendation for new players. The burn aspect, the slower version, is something that I would definitely recommend towards more intermediate or maybe advanced players, because you will have to make a lot of pretty challenging decisions relative to a more straightforward aggro deck. There are a lot of positions where you'll have to decide exactly how to best close out the late game, and I find it pretty challenging. I mean, don't get me wrong, sometimes you just have a nuts hand and you just kind of like jam it in and you're good, but there will be some challenging positions with this deck, so definitely if that sounds like the approach for you, I'd recommend it. And the last deck I have for you is Taliyah Thralls. Now, this is a deck that, well, it's slightly different, but you also might notice this from a video I put out on this channel in the last few days. So Legends of Thralls is a deck that is kind of an effective mid-range hybrid that you are playing for Frozen Thralls. You're making sure that you're getting Frostguard Thralls every time. You've got 1 or 2 Stone Weavings to be able to sometimes get additional Frostguard Thralls if you play this at 2 mana. And what that means is your opponent doesn't really have good ways of interacting with these, and as you're advancing them and leveling them, when you use Promising Future or Taliyah to clone it as well, you can generate some really scary boards over time. This is a very tricky deck to play, and it will lead to some super unique situations. So if you are up for a challenge, it's actually really not bad. The only reason that it might be a little bit awkward into this meta right now is most of what this deck is going to want to do is try to challenge into the more control-y matchups, right? This is a great deck to take down stuff like, Lysandra Trundle or stuff like Targon. But as mentioned, those are, at least for the current time being, not really the decks to beat in this current metagame, so I don't expect this one to do anything crazy anytime soon. However, I can promise you guys that by the fact that this deck has very powerful and very unique matchup tables, there will come a time where somebody's going to bring it in a tournament lineup and do well in like, a fight night or, a top cut seasonals or something, and everyone's going to be surprised because everyone thinks of this as a meme deck. It is a deck that is very specifically good in certain kinds of metas, and definitely a lot better than it looks, but I don't think it's going to end up being competitive in this meta. Now, those are the 5 new decks this week. Now let's get into 5 older decks that I would likewise recommend for different reasons. We'll talk about where they're fitting into the meta, but I'm just going to start at the top with Thresh Nasus. Okay, this is an easy one. Don't worry, I'm not going to do this one every single week. And yeah, Thresh Nasus is basically the big dog of the meta for a while now, and it's a deck that even got some additional help with the new card Merciless Hunter. Effectively, it's a great meta call. Like I said, the meta speeds up and Thresh Nasus fits into that. It's a natural counter against Irelia Azir, because what this deck is trying to do is it's kind of got a hybrid aggro combo game plan, sort of similar to, you know, Irelia Azir, where we're just going to go on an early game aggression with our cards like Bakai Reaper, cards like Cursed Keeper, Butcher, and Blighted Caretaker, and we're going to be making sure we've got some great anti-aggro strategies in place. We've got good defensive units like Fading Icon and Dune Keeper, and we're usually owning the board from an early position, which is what makes Thresh Nasus a natural counter to aggro, right? And then it's of course got its late game finisher, which you can protect, which is Nasus, pullable from Thresh, and you can use Atrocity on Nasus to win the game. It's a very, very powerful and well-rounded deck. No new information here. I mean, you guys know all that, I'm sure. Now, the one thing that's unique about my version is I'm not running this new card, the Wings and the Wave. This is going to be a bit of a hot take because a lot of people like this card, but I actually think it's a complete bait in Thresh Nasus. I might end up running 1 or 2 of, but I certainly don't like 3. The reasons for this are because it offers a lot of flexibility, but mostly it hurts a lot of matchups. It's really hard to fit into this deck. And the flexibility it provides is just really awkward in a few ways. When you're using it to sacrifice a unit, it's very significantly worse than Butcher, because at 1 mana, Butcher's ability... I mean, Butcher, the entire point of Butcher is that it's a 0 mana card, right? Like, you can use it on 2 with Keeper, but, I mean, you can use it on turn 3 with, you know, Keeper into an attack, or like Caretaker on 3. But it doesn't fulfill any of the important Butcher curves at 1 mana. It doesn't have the anti-aggro stat line that Fading Icon does. And it provides 2 sack targets instead of a blocker and a sack target, which is a very, very different thing. 2 sack targets is only good at unbricking weird hands like Spirit Leech. So my version uniquely does not run the Wings and the Wave. But like I said, that's a hot take. I want to, you know, always be drawing a line so that you guys understand what is an opinion of mine and what I say is, you know, usually when I say things, they are representative of like everything that the top player community agrees on and the stats. This is one that we don't have stats yet, and a lot of pros also end up liking it, so who knows. All right, the next deck up is Ezreal Draven. This is actually a really powerful counter meta option right now. Ezreal Draven is effectively a sort of control mid-range hybrid where you're playing for some tempo game plan. You do have a lot of proactive plays, and a lot of the time you will put pressure on your opponent with your early swarm units like Draven and like Sump Dredger, and just start dealing a lot of chip damage to maybe, you know, finish them off a little bit in the later game. You can also control your opponent's strategy pretty well, which is something that you do against Irelia Azir. You use Culling Strike and Scorched Earth to stop their Azir and Darius, or Culling Strike a Thresh. Basically, you're shutting down the opponent's game plan while simultaneously developing your own, all the while working towards the big kind of like mid-range value finisher of Tri-Beam and Populator. When you put off one of these, you know, puppies that has like 6 or 7 charges stacked on it, you will often find a way to just close the game on the spot off of that raw value. Now, this is a pretty tricky deck to play. You have to be very flexible in game plan. You need to know when to be the aggressor and when to just be the stabilizer, and you need to be very comfortable with passing. This is a deck that plays for reactivity, and something that a lot of new players have in Runeterra, a problem that they have, even if they come from other card games, is underrating reactivity. When you're playing a reactive deck, like Ezreal Draven, or like Shadow Elf Fire Control, or like Thomas Raka, or some kinds of Targons or PNZ style decks, you need to be passing on a lot of actions. You should, like in most of the turns in the game, about half maybe, you should be starting with a pass to see what the opponent does first. Even if you have a play you want to make, you just have to ask yourself, does the opponent, you know, would the opponent be able to pass back if I passed? And would they be happy passing there, right? If you're burning their mana along with yours, you're usually fine. But reactivity is king, and you always want to see what the opponent is playing first, unless it's a really bad pass for you, unless they're going to be burning your mana or you need to make a play specifically. This is something that I've made multiple videos about, and I'll put one in the pinned comment if you also want reference to that. But I can tell you it's night and day when you're playing against any player who likes a control-y deck. There's a lot of you guys that I promise once you learn how to pass, you'll become addicted. You'll only be able to play pass decks. There's a lot of players I know that their favorite thing to do is just smash that spacebar button. Just pass every turn and just force reactivity onto their opponent and just jerk off while doing it. And Yeah, I mean, I can't lie. It's amazing. This is also a deck where you're going to need to be thinking about your banked spell mana. A lot of mistakes people make are, you know, they'll use ignitions when there's not really a reason to, or they'll use Ezreal's fleeting Mystic Shot just to use it when there's not really a reason to. You need to have purpose in everything you do, and banking spell mana is a really, really important thing for reactivity. So it is a hard deck, but it is very powerful. And I mean, don't get me wrong. It's not as if you're not going to be able to win with this deck if you're not like a top level player. It's got a really high skill ceiling, but it's still a very powerful deck, so you'll be able to win with this deck. Pick this up if you're looking for a challenge, if you're looking to be able to shut down metas. A lot of players like the feeling of playing a deck that doesn't really have bad matchups, right? Like Ezreal Draven is one of those decks that doesn't really have a terrible matchup. You can usually outplay your way into a victory, and it does have some really good matchups too. All right, the next deck that's pretty sweet right now is Shurima Overwhelm. Now, this is, a kind of like slower mid-range version of Overwhelm. We're going to be kind of just developing bulky bodies, keeping beef on the board, and killing the opponent with kind of like a tempo-oriented strategy. More proactive plays, but because we have a lot of beef, we are a lot less susceptible towards losing out to the opponent's early game sort of like control-y strategies that would kind of stop aggro in its tracks. For that reason, we are better against Thresh Nasus. It's a proactive kind of aggro-y style strategy, but unlike aggro, which gets countered by Thresh Nasus, Overwhelm will smash through Thresh Nasus's chump blockers, which is really perfect. It's also going to do a little bit better into the controlier decks, as well as stuff like, maybe Ezreal Draven as well. This will do just fine against, whereas aggro can get a little bit more shut down. It's not amazing into Azir Irelia, which is, of course, part of the name of the game right now, but it's not as bad as it might seem. The fact that Ruthless Raider is tough gives you free blockers for several turns until they level their Azir is really nice, and usually this deck can turn around and kill them very quickly. With Battle Fury on a big Overwhelm unit, usually Ruin Runner, a large part of the point of this deck is to just buff your Overwhelm units and smack face, and Ruin Runner having the natural spell shield is just the perfect buff target. If you're looking for tips playing this deck, I would definitely recommend making sure that you're thinking about your Rock Hopper use. A lot of times you might have to take some kind of weird passes, but you can be using this card to make your opponent's plays slightly more awkward. Like, for example, if you play Rock Hopper on turn 2 when the opponent has first action next turn, then you're kind of locking them out of potentially an Azir. Think about what their deck is and think about when you want to use this card and what you're locking the opponent out of. Sometimes it'll make a bit more sense to, play it instead of Ruthless Raider on turn 2, and sometimes you might want to pass to see your opponent play a card so that your Rock Hopper can then come down on the same turn, and instead of getting absorbed by that card, lock the opponent out of your next action. So just plan a turn ahead. There's a lot of skill expression with Rock Hopper. You really need to be thinking about what the opponent has and what they're playing, not just this turn, but next turn. Also, I see a lot of people really misusing Battle Fury in this deck. Battle Fury is a really, really important card. A lot of people are under the impression that because this card is 8 mana, it is a late game card, and it definitely can be, but there's a lot of hand states where you're going to want to jam Battle Fury on literally turn 5 into an attack, right? You can just use Battle Fury on Ruthless Raider on turn 5 in some matchups and just swing in, right? And as bizarre as it sounds, there will definitely be matchups where keeping Battle Fury in your opening hand can actually be pretty sweet. So only do this in positions where your opponent isn't going to have something that just slaps you really hard as a counter. But if you're looking to race down decks that you just need to be able to race down, like Azir Irelia, Battle Fury can definitely be the big helper there. Another deck that I'd really recommend into this meta right now is Nightfall. And Nightfall, let me tell you, might be a real sleeper. Sort of similar to Shyvana, there is definitely a chance Nightfall is actually going to get bumped up to tier 1 next week. This deck is very, very good into the current meta, but quite a bit tricky to play if you want to be countering every matchup, right? You will have to do a lot of weird stuff. It is an aggro sort of like kind of like aggro anti-mirror deck, where you're often doing very well against the opponent's aggressive strategies because you can slow down while stopping them and while just, you know, providing blockers to the board as well. But you have some very scary fearsome punch through with a leveled Nocturne, and you have some crazy combo plays with stuff like Stygian Onlooker, Fading Memories that a lot of Shadow Isles aggro decks are using as well. So if you're looking for something fast with real skill expression, Nightfall is absolutely going to be great for you in this metagame. It's a good deck at just shutting down a lot of what the meta is trying to do. It's a great deck into Nasus Thresh, into Azir Irelia, into all forms of aggro, and it's pretty flexible too. You can play it, despite it being a fast deck, there's so many decisions in terms of the mulligan, in terms of when to bank mana to activate Nightfall, stuff like that, that you will be able to have. There's not really any matchups that are truly horrendous, and you'll be able to outplay your way to a victory in a surprising amount of situations. And our 10th and final deck is Discard Aggro. Actually pretty similar to Nightfall, all things considered, which is that it's an aggro deck that I wouldn't say this one's a little bit easier than Nightfall for the most part, but it's kind of a middle ground between the super easy aggro decks and the more difficult ones. Nightfall plays at a more flexible speed. Discard Aggro has a pretty high skill expression, but it won't test that in every single game. A lot of games will play out very straightforward. Basically, you just swarm the board with aggressive units, and you know, we're going to sometimes pop off with big swarm buffs like Battlecaster and Vision in the same exact way as Shurima Nox aggro. Battlecaster and just the general swarm strategies are pretty in right now because there's not a lot of sweepers to knock them down. Then you've got the backup game plan of leveled Jinx or maybe augmented Experimenter when you're running out of steam. Slap that on with some big crowd favorites in the mid game, and you've got a pretty terrifying and pretty flexible aggro deck. So I'd recommend Discard if you're looking for an aggro deck that's kind of a little bit more in the intermediate difficulty range. It's a super powerful deck, and it's one that will have a hard time going out of fashion, right? Nightfall is a bit more of a meta call, whereas Discard Aggro has been a staple of the metagame for over a year now, actually. Yeah, no, this deck just does not go out of fashion. All right, and that's it for this week's update on the meta. So I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of new format. There's a lot more to learn in terms of kind of how to play specific decks. I want to, you know, do a little bit more in terms of, you know, maybe some like mulligan stuff and some kind of like slightly more in-depth tips, but my hope is that you guys are able to get a lot more out of this format in terms of finding a specific deck you're looking for, in terms of, you know, a couple of tips from the deck taking a long way, and a better understanding of how the meta works and what kinds of decks you can bring to counter specific kinds of metas, right? Because I really want you guys to not just be like, oh, you know, I'll play this deck, and not just jam the same deck, but be able to, you know, make your own choices about what deck is good to play at what time. All right, guys. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. Let me know if you guys, like, seriously, I'm not just doing the YouTuber thing. I will read the comments, and I am looking for advice because I do need tips on how to, you know, maybe restructure this or augment this new format in any way. But let me know if you guys have any ideas or recommendations about how to improve this series, and I'm glad to be back at doing it weekly once again. All right, that's it for me, and I'll see you guys next time.